Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but for a group of captured German women, former auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks, the war had not yet ended inside them. The trucks that carried them from the train station to the American prisoner camp rattled through the dust roads of Texas, sunlight flickering through barbed fences and mesquite trees. The air smelled of hot metal and hay. They clutched their satchels as if holding on to a last shred of control. Each bump made them flinch. The fear that had been drilled into them by years of propaganda grew louder with every mile. They said the Americans were animals, one whispered. They take what they want. Another nodded silently, her hands trembling around a small Bible. When the truck stopped, the gates creaked open with a slow metallic groan. Beyond them stood rows of wooden barracks, their roofs shimmering in the Texas heat. A flag rippled lazily against the pale blue sky, an unfamiliar symbol of both freedom and dread. The guards waited in silence. Most were barely older than the women stepping down from the truck. Dust swirled around their boots. The women expected shouting, groping hands, humiliation. Instead, they heard polite voices. "Ma'am, watch your step. Please line up here. You'll be given food and water shortly." The words sounded alien, rehearsed, too calm to be real. They glanced at one another, certain this kindness was a cruel trick. Inside the camp, the world smelled of soap and earth instead of gunpowder. The women were separated into quarters with bunks and blankets. They found wash basins, mirrors, even small windows that let in light. For a moment, no one spoke. It was easier to believe the silence was a trap. The guards kept their distance, eyes averted. When one soldier passed out metal cups of water, a woman slapped his hand away, certain he meant to grab her. He didn't react. He just set the cup down and stepped back. The confusion was unbearable. They had prepared their hearts for violation, not civility. One woman, Liesel, a 26-year-old nurse from Dresden, stared at the guard through the chain-link fence that evening. He was whittling a piece of wood with quiet focus, not even looking at her. She wanted to hate him, needed to, but there was nothing to fight. No sneer, no cruelty, just the strange stillness of discipline. Around her, the others whispered that it was an act, that the Americans were waiting until night. Fear was easier than uncertainty. Fear, at least, was familiar. As night fell, the camp hummed with the sound of insects and distant laughter from the guardhouse. The women lay awake, every creak of what a possible footstep, but no one came. The guards changed shifts quietly. Their boots faded down the gravel path, replaced by others who said little and did even less. Hours passed. Morning broke, and they realized they had slept through a night without being touched. That single fact was more unsettling than any nightmare. The following day, during roll call, the officer in charge, a tall man with a southern accent, explained the rules through an interpreter. "You will not be harmed. You will work, eat, and rest according to schedule. No one here will touch you without permission. You are under the protection of the United States Army." The translator hesitated on the last sentence, perhaps unable to believe it herself. The women glanced at one another. Protection. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had misfired. Liesel noticed small details that broke the image of the monsters she had been warned about. The Americans tipped their hats when passing women. They called them Miss instead of Fräulein. They offered cigarettes but turned away when they were refused. When one guard accidentally brushed against a woman while handing out bread, he muttered a quick apology as if he'd committed a crime. It made no sense. Everything she had been taught, everything Goebbels' voice had thundered through radios, was untrue. The irony gnawed at her. The Reich that preached purity had used women like tools. The enemy that preached freedom treated them like humans. She tried to explain this to another nurse, Marta, who still believed it was deception. "They'll show their real face soon," Marta said coldly. "Just wait." But days turned into weeks, and the real face never appeared. Instead, the guards brought books, sometimes even newspapers. They encouraged the women to write letters, though few had anyone left to write to. By June, the Texas heat grew fierce, pressing down like a punishment. The women were allowed to walk in a fenced field for an hour each day. Some sat in the grass, too weak to care, while others just stared at the horizon where oil pumps bobbed like slow, mechanical birds. The Americans offered lemonade on Sundays. First, no one took it. Then one day Liesel did. The soldier serving her, brown-haired, sunburnt, polite, nodded once and handed her the cup without a word. Their hands didn't touch. That simple, deliberate avoidance struck her harder than any slap could have. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They did not touch me. They could have. They did not." The others began to notice, too. Small acts of restraint, of distance, of quiet respect. The men guarded them not as spoils of war but as human responsibilities. The women began to relax in small, invisible ways. Slower breathing, softer tones, laughter returning in whispers. Yet none of it erased the shame of having expected cruelty. In their minds, they had already condemned these men before meeting them. That guilt settled deep in their chests like dust that never left. Sometimes the guards played music over the loudspeakers, a harmonica, country songs, once even a recording of swing jazz. It filled the camp with strange emotion. A few of the younger women tapped their shoes under their bunks, then caught themselves, remembering who they were supposed to hate. The music stopped, but the rhythm stayed in their minds. Slowly, humanity seeped through the cracks of propaganda. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, lightning splitting the sky. Rain hammered the roofs, leaking through cracks and holes. When one barrack flooded, a group of soldiers rushed in to move the women to safety. They shouted directions, carried blankets, and worked until dawn. Not a single inappropriate word or gesture. By sunrise, the women were soaked, shivering, but untouched. Liesel watched one of the young guards wipe mud from his face and laugh tiredly. He met her gaze just long enough to nod. She nodded back. It was the first silent truce between enemies she had ever felt. The next morning, rumors spread again, this time among the guards. Some joked that the German women feared being helped. Others said quietly, "Let them see how real men behave. They weren't saints. They were soldiers trying to prove that decency could outlast hatred." But for the women, that proof began to change everything. Days later, an officer arrived for inspection. The women stood straight, expecting interrogation. He looked around, took off his hat and said, "Ladies, you're safe here." That was all. He left behind silence thicker than any speech. Liesel realized then that the war had taken everything except her ability to feel astonishment. At night, she watched the flag fluttering in the moonlight. It no longer looked like a threat. It looked like a promise she didn't yet understand. Around her, the others slept, some murmuring names, others breathing softly for the first time since captivity began. The irony had come full circle. They had been terrified of being touched, yet the only touch they received was of mercy. The enemy they feared most had defeated them not with bullets, but with restraint. They expected chains. They got respect. The enemy they feared refused to touch them. This was the story of mercy that broke propaganda. Days blended into weeks beneath the relentless Texas sun. The German women began to find rhythm in captivity. A rhythm of labor, mealtime, inspection, silence. Yet beneath that rhythm pulsed confusion. They were prisoners but not victims. They were captives but not abused. That contradiction gnawed at them. The first few days they had walked with arms folded tightly, refusing to speak even among themselves, waiting for the cruelty that never came. Now, as June burned into July, something stranger than fear began to take hold. Uncertainty mixed with reluctant gratitude. In the mornings, they lined up outside the barracks for roll call. The American guards checked names with mechanical politeness. Their rifles rested easy on their shoulders. Their eyes never wandered. Sometimes, a breeze would sweep across the yard, carrying the faint smell of the mess hall, coffee and fried bread. For women who had seen cities burn, the smell of ordinary breakfast was almost unbearable. It reminded them of everything lost. One of the older prisoners, Greta, whispered one day, "It's easier when they're cruel. Then you can keep hating them." The younger ones didn't answer. Work assignments filled the afternoons. Washing uniforms, mending sacks, tending vegetable patches fenced off behind barbed wire. The tasks were dull but strangely peaceful. No overseers screamed. No blows fell. When the guards spoke, their voices were firm but even. And still, the women refused to look them in the eye. Each moment of decency felt like another trick. Then one blistering afternoon, something happened that would shatter their fear more effectively than words ever could. A nurse named Erica, thin, pale, barely 30, collapsed near the field where the women were gathering cotton. The heat had drained her strength. She fell to her knees, whispering that her chest hurt. The others froze, paralyzed by the old dread that any show of weakness could invite humiliation. A young American medic rushed over, dropping his canteen. He knelt beside her but did not touch her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his accent soft and uncertain. "May I check your pulse?" The women stared. The question itself seemed absurd. No soldier had ever asked for permission before laying a hand on a woman. Erica could barely nod. Her lips cracked. The medic waited until she managed a whisper of consent. Only then did he place 2 fingers against her wrist. His movements deliberate, almost reverent. He gave her water, helped her to the shade, and called for the camp nurse. When she opened her eyes again, the first thing she said was, "He asked." That moment spread through the camp like wildfire. That evening, whispers filled the bunks. "He asked before touching her. He waited. They follow rules we didn't think existed." The words rolled from mouth to mouth, uncertain, disbelieving. For some, it brought relief. For others, shame. Marta, the same woman who had sworn it was all an act, spat bitterly. "It's theater. They want to look good for the Red Cross." But her voice lacked conviction now. Doubt had begun to erode her certainty. The next day, the same medic appeared again, this time handing out tablets for sunburns. He spoke gently, explaining each one through an interpreter. Liesel watched him closely. His hands were steady, his tone professional. When he finished, he gave a half-smile, the kind that came not from charm but simple kindness. For the first time, Liesel felt her throat tighten. Not with fear, but something she couldn't name. Respect, perhaps, or the strange ache of being treated as human after years of hate. Over the following weeks, the camp's atmosphere shifted subtly. The women began to speak English phrases they picked up. "Thank you," "please," "good morning." The guards, amused, replied in broken German. Some exchanges ended with shy laughter that quickly died into awkward silence. Even the air seemed to soften. A few women, noticing how clean the Americans kept their quarters, started sweeping their own barracks more carefully, hanging laundry in straight lines. Dignity was contagious. One afternoon, a new guard, a young man named Corporal Haynes, decided to plant flowers along the fence. The women watched him dig holes under the barbed wire, sweat dripping from his brow. When Liesel asked the interpreter why he was doing it, Haynes shrugged. "Figure it'll make the place less ugly," he said. That night, when the moon rose, tiny white blossoms gleamed against the wire. Some of the women cried without knowing why. Still, not everyone was ready to believe. Greta muttered that the Americans had the luxury of mercy only because they had already won. "Kindness is easy for victors," she said, sewing silently. Yet even she began leaving out a bucket of water each morning for the guards to refill during inspection. She told herself it was practical, not polite. But the lie was transparent. One day, the camp commander gathered everyone by the mess hall. The Red Cross had arrived to inspect conditions. The women stood stiffly, eyes straight ahead, expecting this to be the moment when masks would drop. But the inspection passed quietly. The Red Cross officer smiled, thanked the commander, and noted that conditions were exceptional. After they left, one of the guards called out to the prisoners, "You can relax now, ladies. We passed." The laughter that followed was genuine, bright, and utterly disarming. For the first time, Liesel smiled openly, a small, cracked thing that felt like rebellion against everything she'd been told. That night, She sat on her bunk writing by candlelight. She wrote not about fear or survival, but about contradiction. We were told they would use us. They use rules instead. We were told they were savages. They act like priests. The sound of a harmonica drifted through the camp fence. Soft, almost sorrowful. She closed her notebook and listened. The melody was unlike anything from Germany. Slow, wandering, patient. It filled the night with the feeling of home, even though it came from the enemy. Still, the struggle wasn't over. Doubt returned in waves. When the guards brought extra food one evening, canned peaches left over from supply trucks, the women hesitated again. Marta hissed. They feed us sweet things so we forget who they are. But Liesel bit into one, syrup spilling over her fingers. Tasted like sunlight and freedom. She didn't care anymore who they were supposed to be. The next morning, while cleaning the infirmary, she saw the medic again. This time she spoke first. "Danke," she said softly. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. "You're welcome, ma'am." The exchange lasted 3 seconds, but it broke something invisible. The wall between them didn't collapse. It cracked just enough to let truth through. Word of the camp's strange peace began to spread. Letters arrived from other POW facilities describing similar treatment. The women learned that in Europe, German soldiers were surrendering to Americans by the thousands rather than to the Soviets. Some of the guards joked that the words out were too nice to shoot anybody. But behind the jokes was quiet pride. As the weeks passed, new prisoners arrived, women from Italy, Austria, and captured labor units. They came terrified, just as the first group once had been. And now it was Liesel's group that comforted them. "They won't hurt you," she told one trembling girl. "They don't even touch you without asking." The words felt surreal in her own mouth. She could hear the echo of the person she used to be, the one who would never have believed them. That evening, the sun dipped low over the camp, staining the sky gold and crimson. The flower garden had bloomed into a patch of fragile beauty between two worlds. The women stood by the fence, watching the guards play cards in the fading light. One of them laughed so loudly that the sound startled them at first. Then, almost without thinking, one of the prisoners began to hum the same tune the harmonica had played nights ago. Another joined in. The sound floated across the wire, blending German and American voices into something wordless and human. When lights out came, Liesel lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling. Her fear had melted away, replaced by something harder to define, an aching curiosity about the world outside the fence. For the first time, she wondered not when she would go home, but whether she wanted to return to the same kind of world she had left behind. But outside, far beyond the barbed wire, word of these soft camps reached Berlin. In the final days of the collapsing Reich, officers laughed bitterly at the notion that American soldiers treated their prisoners with respect. They called it cowardice. Yet they could not deny the numbers. Entire units were surrendering westward instead of eastward, chasing that strange rumor of mercy. What began as kindness inside one camp was quietly reshaping the war itself. And none of the women inside knew that their small daily miracles, one question, one refusal to harm, were echoing across a dying empire. Still, as the night deepened, the air grew heavy again. A guard's flashlight swept across the barracks, pausing briefly on the women's faces. Liesel closed her eyes, half expecting the beam to linger too long, the moment of violation to finally come. But it moved on. Always it moved on. And in that fleeting light, she understood something her captors had never said aloud. That power was not in domination, but in discipline. The war might be raging oceans away, but here, inside the quiet heart of America, a different kind of victory was being written, one heartbeat at a time. Autumn crept slowly into the Texas plains, softening the heat but not the memory of it. By now, the German women had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the camp. They rose with the bugle, worked, rested, wrote letters, and listened to music that didn't sound like war. Yet outside the barbed wire, something larger was changing. The world was ending for the Reich, and the echoes of that collapse reached even here, through rumors, through Red Cross letters, through the anxious glances of guards who now spoke more softly about the surrender that's coming. The women could feel it. The power that once terrified the world was cracking apart. And with every new surrender, the moral balance of the war tilted in an unexpected way. It began with whispers from new arrivals, soldiers captured in France and the Low Countries, stunned by how differently the Americans treated them. "They fed us before they questioned us," one said, disbelieving. "They gave us cigarettes, blankets." To those who had seen the Eastern Front, this was unthinkable. Prisoners taken by the Soviets disappeared forever. Prisoners taken by the Americans gained weight. Word traveled like wildfire through collapsing German lines. Surrender west, not east. The fear of brutality that once kept men fighting began to fade, replaced by the hope of survival. The irony was breathtaking. Inside the Texas camp, the women noticed it first in the guards' attitudes. They seemed almost relieved that the end was near. The war had aged them even in safety. Now they spoke of homecomings, harvests, girls waiting in Kansas or Ohio. When one woman asked what would happen to them after the surrender, the camp officer replied, "You'll go home once it's safe." The way he said it carried no mockery, no gloating, just simple truth. For women who had expected nothing but punishment, such ordinary mercy felt monumental. The American command had quietly realized that how they treated their prisoners mattered far beyond these fences. Reports from Geneva were circulating through Washington, German captives describing humane treatment in American hands, contrasting it with Soviet atrocities. Each testimony became a weapon of reputation. The U.S. Army didn't need propaganda posters. It had the prisoners themselves as witnesses. What had begun as decency became a deliberate strategy. And so, kindness hardened into policy. Guards were instructed more strictly than ever. No contact, no harassment, no fraternization. But there was also no humiliation. Women were given sewing materials, books, even English lessons. A visiting chaplain held voluntary sermons for both sides. One day, the interpreter read out a verse from the Gospel of Luke. "Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." The camp fell silent. To the German women, it sounded like madness, yet a kind of madness that disarmed every defense they had left. The letters home told the story better than any report. Liesel wrote, "We are treated as guests of war, not prisoners. They smile when we say thank you. I am no longer afraid of the night." Another woman, younger and more cynical, admitted, "I expected to die here. Instead, I learned to sleep without fear." Those letters passed through censors, but even censored words carried truth. By the time they reached Europe, they had already changed hearts. German families began praying that their sons would be captured by the Americans rather than fight to the last bullet. Mercy had become contagious. Meanwhile, the Nazi propaganda machine raged in denial. German broadcasts mocked American softness and called their treatment of POWs a sign of moral weakness. But the lie no longer worked. The very thing they mocked, the refusal to exploit, to touch, to dominate, had become the reason why so many Germans surrendered westward instead of east. It was the turning of a tide no weapon could reverse. By the winter of 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners were scattered across camps in the United States. They worked the fields, built fences, repaired roads, all under supervision but not under cruelty. And among them, stories spread about the women's camp in Texas. They were terrified at first, one male POW recalled later. But then they saw the Americans didn't treat them like trophies. That rumor reached even the front lines. It made us think, if our women were safe, maybe there was still decency left in the world. The transformation inside the camp was subtle but profound. The women began to teach German songs to the guards. In return, the Americans played swing records from a portable radio. For a few stolen moments, the fence between them blurred into irrelevance. One evening, during Christmas preparations, the Americans brought small paper decorations, stars, bells, and strings of colored foil. They handed them through the wire. No speeches were made. The women hung them quietly around the barracks. That night, as carols floated between languages, even the barbed wire seemed gentler in the glow of lantern light. But the real miracle was happening far from Texas. In France, Belgium, and Italy, surrender lines lengthened daily. German troops, remembering tales of humane treatment, dropped their weapons at the first sign of an American patrol. One captured officer later told an interrogator, "I would rather be a prisoner of America than a free man in Russia." That statement, recorded in a debriefing file, was the truest symbol of the war's moral reversal. The irony deepened when American officers began noticing the psychological effect of mercy on their own men. Soldiers who once burned with vengeance found purpose in discipline. The clear line between them and their enemy wasn't just firepower, it was conduct. To be American now meant to prove control, to show that civilization could survive even in war. When reports of atrocities elsewhere reached the camps, the guards grew more determined to uphold their standards. "We don't become what we fight," one sergeant said flatly. That line passed among the men until it became a quiet motto. One cold morning, news came that Germany had finally surrendered. The camp bells rang, and for a moment no one knew whether to cheer or cry. The guards smiled. The women stood motionless. For them, victory didn't look like fireworks, it looked like silence. Some wept openly. The officer in charge gathered everyone and said simply, "The war is over. You are now our responsibility until repatriation." The words "our responsibility" echoed louder than any anthem. In the days that followed, there was no celebration, only relief. The guards stopped carrying rifles. The women were allowed to walk outside the inner fence under supervision. Liesel stepped into open pasture for the first time in months. She looked up at the sky, free of planes and smoke, and felt an ache she couldn't name. Freedom, perhaps, or forgiveness. Behind her, one of the guards took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you'll be going home soon." She didn't answer. She just nodded, tears running silently down her dust-streaked face. That moment, simple, wordless, human, was repeated thousands of times across the continent. German prisoners shaking the hands of their captors, thanking them for mercy they never expected. The contrast to the Eastern Front couldn't have been sharper. While one side's vengeance bred fear, the other side's restraint bred surrender. Even historians later struggled to describe it. How could a nation win not just with might, but with morality? How could empathy itself become a weapon? Yet that's what had happened. By refusing to violate, America had conquered something greater than territory. It had conquered belief. The myth of the savage enemy had collapsed under the weight of its own lies. In April 1946, as repatriations began, a U.S. officer wrote in his report, "Our discipline achieved what propaganda could not. They no longer hate us, they admire us." He didn't mean admiration for power or victory. He meant admiration for restraint. The German women, once terrified captives, now shook hands with the guards who had never crossed a line. One even handed her English dictionary back to the medic who'd given it to her months ago. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe you'll visit one day." She smiled faintly. Perhaps. That afternoon, as buses rumbled away carrying the women toward ports and ships and homes they barely remembered, the camp fell silent again. Only the wind moved through the empty bunks, lifting scraps of paper and petals from the fence garden. On one of the bunks lay a single torn page from a notebook, left behind by Liesel. It read, "They won not because they were stronger. They won because they refused to be cruel." And somewhere, in a ruined corner of Europe, other prisoners heard the same stories and laid down their arms. Mercy had traveled farther than any bullet ever could. What had begun as discipline had turned into dominance. Not the dominance of force, but of principle. The enemy who once terrified the world had surrendered not to American firepower, but to American conscience. The tide had turned, and its roar was silent. Months passed before the ships arrived to carry them home. By then, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a strange purgatory between worlds. The German women moved through their routines with practiced grace. Packing, cleaning, folding blankets they would never see again. The guards shook their hands, helped carry their trunks, even posed for a few photographs. In the pictures, nobody smiled broadly, but there was a quiet softness in their eyes, the kind that only comes from surviving something together. The war was over, but the memory of how it had ended here, without hate, without shame, would outlive the fences. Liesel stood by the gate on her final morning, watching the flag move gently in the wind. She thought of the day she had arrived, terrified, certain she would be violated the moment the gates closed. Now she felt something close to gratitude. The same symbol that had once looked like domination now looked like discipline. When the truck engine coughed to life, she turned one last time toward the camp. A few guards waved. She didn't wave back. She just raised her hand to her chest and held it there. A silent salute to decency. The road to the port was long and dry, stretching endlessly under a sky too wide to understand. Along the way, small towns came and went, each one looking untouched by war. Children played on porches. Men tipped their hats. America, she realized, hadn't known what it was like to have its soil burned and its women broken. Perhaps that was why they could afford kindness. But even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that what she had seen was something deeper. Something chosen, not inherited. A nation strong enough to win, but humble enough not to humiliate. When the ship departed from New Orleans, the women stood at the railing, their hair whipping in the sea wind. None of them spoke. The ocean stretched like a mirror of everything they didn't yet understand. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the horizon where the sun melted into the waves. One woman whispered, "They never touched us." Another added, "They didn't have to." The statement hung between them like a benediction. Back in Europe, the reality of defeat was everywhere. Cities flattened, men lost, ideals shattered. Yet those who had been prisoners of the Americans carried an invisible difference. They spoke of fair treatment, of rules, of dignity. The contrast was jarring. Those returning from Soviet camps came home skeletal, haunted, silent. Those returning from American camps came home alive, even healthy. In villages still nursing hatred, these stories spread like uneasy truths. It was hard to believe that mercy had been shown when everything else in their world screamed vengeance. Liesel found her hometown reduced to ash. Dresden's ruins still smelled faintly of smoke. Her parents were gone, her hospital destroyed. She walked the silent streets with her suitcase, the sound of broken glass under her boots echoing through hollow buildings. Yet beneath the weight of loss, she carried a strange strength. She had learned something the ruins could not erase. That morality, when tested by fire, either collapses or hardens into something unbreakable. She began volunteering at a small clinic run by the Red Cross. When refugees came through, women trembling from what they had endured in the East, Liesel listened. They spoke of Russian soldiers, of night raids, of everything she had once feared would happen to her. The difference between their stories and hers was unbearable. One woman asked her, "You were captured too? How did you survive?" Liesel hesitated, then answered softly, "Because they asked before touching me." The other woman stared at her, disbelief mixed with envy. In that moment, Liesel realized that her survival was more than luck. It was a testament. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, the American officers filed their reports. They spoke of efficiency, discipline, and positive psychological outcomes. But behind the bureaucratic tone lay a quiet pride. The humane treatment of German POWs had not just followed the Geneva Convention, it had expanded it. Those lessons shaped the 1949 revisions that strengthened international humanitarian law. When the Cold War began and nations again built their armies, they also built codes of conduct modeled on those very camps. Mercy had entered the machinery of policy. For the Americans who had served as guards, the experience stayed with them too. Some wrote letters to their former prisoners, exchanging photographs or short notes of peace. A few even reunited years later when the women immigrated to the United States under post-war resettlement programs. One became a nurse in Chicago. Another married the very medic who had once asked for her consent to check a pulse. History is often written in the language of battles, but sometimes it hides in the quiet grammar of respect. Decades later, historians uncovered interviews from those camps. One German nurse, now an old woman, said in her testimony, "They defeated us without hatred. That is why they truly won." She recalled how the guards never crossed the invisible line of decency, even when no one was watching. "It made me question everything I had believed about strength," she said. "I thought power meant taking. They showed me it could mean refusing." Her voice trembled when she added, "They gave me back my dignity before giving back my freedom." The moral ripple stretched far beyond Texas. Around the world, America's reputation as a fair victor became one of its most potent tools in rebuilding Europe. Programs like the Marshall Plan drew credibility not just from money, but from the image of restraint that began in camps like these. Mercy became diplomacy. Decency became influence. The country that had dropped bombs also built homes, and the two halves of its identity, destruction and compassion, balanced in uneasy but powerful harmony. Liesl kept a diary long after the war. On the final page she wrote, "We were told to hate them. Instead, they taught us how to live among humans again." When she died in the 1980s, her granddaughter found the old notebook among letters stamped with faded American postmarks. One letter read simply, "I hope you found peace. You helped us prove who we were." It was signed with a name she hadn't mentioned in decades, Corporal Haynes. Time washed the barbed wire away, but the story endured. For historians, it became a footnote. For those who lived it, it remained a quiet revolution. The same women who had once trembled in fear carried within them an unspoken moral legacy. Proof that war could end without annihilating humanity. When they told their children, they did not speak of battles or bombs, but of the small gestures that saved their souls. A guard stepping aside to let them pass first, a hand offering bread without demand, a question asked before a touch given. And so the insult that had once defined their fear transformed into irony. They had believed they would be comfort women, instruments for soldiers' appetites. Instead, they were shown what true comfort meant. Safety, respect, silence, and space to heal. The word itself changed meaning for them. Comfort no longer meant submission, it meant being seen as human. As decades turned into history, filmmakers and authors tried to capture that paradox. Some romanticized it, others doubted it. But the testimonies were consistent. The Americans didn't touch them. They touched their conscience instead. Today, in a world still scarred by new wars and new justifications, the question lingers. Did we learn? Can any army still claim moral high ground when technology makes killing easier than kindness? The lesson of those camps whispers through time, that the true measure of power is not how fiercely a nation fights, but how gently it restrains itself when victory is certain. At the end of her diary, Liesl had written one last line before closing it forever. "Mercy is the only victory that lasts." She never knew how prophetic that would sound decades later. When future generations read her words, they didn't see an enemy nurse or a nameless prisoner. They saw proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could survive inside ordinary people who chose decency over dominance. In the end, history remembered the statistics, the 370,000 prisoners, the thousands of camps, the absence of mass abuse. But what mattered more were the invisible moments. A hand not reaching, a gaze respectfully lowered, a question softly spoken. These were the smallest acts of war, yet they became the greatest victories of peace. The same gates that once confined them became symbols of something nobler, the threshold where hatred stopped and humanity began again. They thought they'd be used as comfort women. Instead, they were comforted by compassion. And as the camera of memory slowly fades from Texas to the broken streets of post-war Germany, one question remains, lingering like smoke over a quiet field. Would we still show that mercy today, if the world caught fire again? Over 370,000 German POWs were held on U.S. soil between 1943 to 1946. The camps were regulated under the 1929 Geneva Convention, ensuring fair treatment, medical care, and safety. Reports by the International Red Cross confirmed humane conditions, a stark contrast to the brutality seen elsewhere. Many former POWs later testified that American soldiers never touched them without permission. This approach influenced the creation of the 1949 Geneva Convention, setting modern standards for human rights in wartime.